Is it just me, or did anyone else feel lied to by the trailers for Civil War? Don't get me wrong, it's an excellent movie, but the title and marketing really made it seem like a film that was going to focus on a second American Civil War. And yes, the movie does take place within a fractured America, but the movie isn't actually interested in the who, what, and why of the conflict. First of all, the factions aren't realistic.
The so-called Western forces of Texas and California.
California and Texas are much more likely to fight each other than against a common enemy. Secondly, the movie doesn't depict any of the major battles aside from the finale, meaning the audience has no idea what happened throughout most of the conflict. And finally, the screenplay doesn't meaningfully explore any of the political beliefs that might cause the country to go to war with itself. The only reasons given for the conflict are that the president disbanded the FBI.
Do you still think it was wise to disband the FBI?
And stayed in office for a third term.
Do you regret any actions implemented during your third term in office?
Which is why, despite what the marketing would have you believe, Civil War is not a movie about Civil War. So then what is this movie actually about? The film opens with the president claiming that the federal government has just dealt a decisive blow against the Western forces, but it's clear from how he talks that it's all just propaganda.
Some are calling it already. Some are already calling it the greatest victory in the history of military campaigns.
We then cut to our main character Lee, who is watching the speech from a hotel room in New York when a bomb goes off outside her window. Right off the bat, the cinematography here tells us a lot about the character. First, it foreshadows her main objective in the movie, which is to reach the president and photograph him before he's executed. Additionally, we see that she's completely unfazed by death and destruction, even when it's on her doorstep. The next day, Lee and her colleague Joel report on a water distribution center where desperate citizens are beginning to riot. There, Lee meets an aspiring journalist named Jesse and winds up saving her life when a bomber runs into the crowd. Real quick, if we dig a little deeper into this scene, I think we can start getting a sense of what the filmmakers are trying to say. Even though the specific details of this conflict are incredibly unrealistic, it's incredibly powerful seeing America depicted in this manner. Americans can see people begging for water or being attacked like this all the time on the news, but it's usually happening on the other side of the globe. Because of this, it's easy for Americans to become callous and desensitized to the suffering of others. They think, sure, things like this happen, but not to me, not to the people who live in my country or look like I do. But when you see a young, blonde, white woman holding the American flag and running into a crowd of people with the intention to cause harm, it suddenly doesn't feel like such a far-off concept. On top of this, the aftermath of the bombing hints at the core issue facing Lee's character. Without a moment's hesitation, Lee walks out into the open and begins taking photos of the carnage. Instead of calling for help or assisting the injured, she simply acts as a passive observer, documenting the horrors around her and refusing to intervene. In the moment, she is cold, distant, and completely professional. But later that night, we see the toll that her work actually takes on her. In flashbacks, we see several different moments where Lee is in the proximity of extreme violence, but each time all she does is snap a photo and ignore the desperate looks from the injured and dying. Now, obviously her job as a photojournalist is to be a passive observer, but Civil War wants the audience to question if such a job can possibly be moral or even ethical. How complicit in violence is the person who watches it play out? And where is the line between being informative and being exploitative? Up until now, Lee has refused to grapple with these questions in a meaningful way. The next day, Lee and Joel get ready to make the journey to DC, where they hope to interview and photograph the president before the Western forces arrive. Reluctantly, Lee also agrees to let Jesse and her mentor Sammy make the journey with them. Now, this is where it became clear to me that, in terms of war movies, Civil War was going to be much closer to Apocalypse Now than, say, Saving Private Ryan. Basically, this means that the narrative is much less about the mission itself and much more about how the characters change over the course of their journey. But before we get started on that journey, let's talk about a web browser that will never waste your time. Opera is my go-to browser while writing scripts or editing videos because its wide array of helpful features allows me to find information quicker, access a wider array of video content, and organize my workflow like never before. When I'm in the middle of writing and need a question answered ASAP, their built-in AI feature Aria makes it easy to get info quickly without sifting through all the SEO nonsense that bloats so many many websites nowadays. If I need to do more in-depth research, Aria allows me to highlight any text online and generate a simplified explanation and summary of what's written. This has personally helped me a lot because when I then read the text in its entirety, I already know what to expect, which makes digesting the new information so much easier. In a similar vein, Opera has this feature known as tab islands that allows you to group different tabs together into different categories. Having separate sections for my text documents, articles, and videos means that I don't get overwhelmed even with a dozen tabs open at the same time. But the aspect of Opera I love the most is that it has a built-in ad blocker and VPN. With just a few clicks, I can eliminate annoying pop-ups and increase my privacy while browsing the internet, all without having to leave the tab I currently have open. With Opera, I feel in control of my web browsing experience at all times. And if you want a faster, safer, and smarter experience too, use the link in my description and download Opera today. The first stop on the group's journey is a gas station protected by a group of armed locals. When Jessie goes to investigate a building nearby, she finds two looters who have been beaten and strung up by the men at the gas station. Despite wanting to be a war photographer, this is clearly the first time Jessie has seen this type of violence up close. When one of the men asks Jessie to decide if they should live or die,
"Why don't you put us and them out of our misery? Make a call."
she's too shocked to say anything,
I'll put rounds in them right now.
and Lee is forced to defuse the situation by asking to take his picture. It might seem like a small moment, but it encapsulates the central question of the movie. Is it better to observe or intervene? Jessie is given the power to decide if the looters live or die, but that agency catches her so off guard that she doesn't do anything. On the other hand, Lee has been in this situation countless times and makes the same decision she always does: just take the picture. Back in the car, Jessie beats herself up for not doing anything.
I didn't take a single photo. I didn't even remember I had cameras on me.
But Lee explains that it's not her job to intervene.
Once you start asking yourself those questions, you can't stop. We record so other people ask.
Sammy and Joel think that Lee is being too harsh, but Jessie agrees with her and promises to be better.
He's right. I won't make that mistake again.
This in turn makes Lee realize that Jessie has what it takes to be a photojournalist, setting up one of the most interesting aspects of the narrative. See, as far as character arcs go, Lee and Jessie are complete opposites. Lee begins as an emotionless professional that learns to question whether or not what she's doing is right, and Jessie goes from being a naive but warm-hearted young woman to being a hardened photojournalist that only cares about getting the final shot. Both arcs examine how people become desensitized to violence over time, and a major theme of this movie is whether or not the desensitization is necessary for survival. Speaking of which, after taking some photos of a downed helicopter, Lee tells Jessie,
There is no version of this that isn't a mistake. I know, because I'm it.
revealing that she doesn't think it's healthy to do what she does or become like her. Something we see a lot throughout the movie is that these characters are all addicted to war in one way or another. Whether it's purpose, understanding, or simply the adrenaline rush, each one of them is searching for something that they can never permanently achieve. Lee knows that once you start down this path, there's only one way you get off it, which is why she's so angry that Jessie decided to join them. Despite her best efforts, there is still a part of Lee that feels emotions, and while she can easily watch on as violence happens to total strangers, she doesn't know how she will feel watching violence happen to people she cares about. Sensing this, Jessie takes the opportunity to ask her,
Would you photograph that moment if I got shot?
to which Lee bluntly answers.
What do you think?
That night, Lee explains to Sammy why she became a war photographer.
Every time I survived a war zone and got the photo, I thought I was sending a warning home. Don't do this.
In addition to revealing a core motivation for the character, this bit of dialogue also explicitly tells the audience what director Alex Garland is trying to do with this movie. Civil War is a warning to the American people, as well as the Western world in general. Violent conflict can infect any nation, regardless of its history, geography, or demographics. And no matter the outcome, everybody loses something. Additionally, this also makes it clear why Garland decided to create such unrealistic alliances and generally avoid discussing anyone's politics. If Civil War was more realistic and depicted a conflict between red and blue political factions, too much focus would be placed on which ideology the movie was endorsing. You'd see commentators like Ben Shapiro or Bill Maher saying that civil war is propaganda meant to demonize one side and glorify the other. But by making the movie largely apolitical, the focus becomes on the conflict itself rather than who is on what side. We see how every person is ravaged in one way or another, and our own biases don't cause us to dehumanize one or more of the factions. Instead of being a movie with a political message, Civil War decided to be a movie with a human message that, hopefully, everyone takes to heart. After hearing gunfire in the distance, Joel convinces the group to go investigate in the morning, which makes this a good time to discuss Joel's character.
Cool.
Personally, I find Joel to be the most nuanced individual in the ensemble. He's deeply dedicated to his work like Lee, but is much more emotionally open as a person.
If you do get freaked out or something, just wake me up. It's not nice being scared alone.
That being said, Joel is not without his flaws. More so than any other character, Joel craves the adrenaline of war.
This gunfire is getting me extremely hard.
He's fine with other people having emotions, but he struggles to feel anything other than extreme highs and extreme lows. He numbs himself with drugs and alcohol and feels restless when he doesn't have a story to chase.
It's not our story.
Yeah, but you know, bang bang.
Which is precisely what leads us into the next scene. That morning, Joel and the gang embed themselves with a squad from the Western Forces as they assault a building being held by federal troops. There, Jesse takes photographs of a man being fatally wounded and the execution of several enemy soldiers. Meanwhile, Sammy watches on with concern, seeing that Jesse is already getting comfortable being around violence. Something to point out about this scene is how the needle drop replaces all diegetic sound in the aftermath of the skirmish. I think what the film is trying to express with this dissonance is how quickly some people compartmentalize tragedy and trauma. This squad leader just witnessed one of his men die, but only a few minutes later, he's laughing it up talking to Joel. Additionally, if the other guys had won the skirmish, Lee and the others might have been taken prisoner or worse, but all Joel can say is, it feels wrong in some ways that people can compartmentalize events like this, but Civil War doesn't seem to fully condemn this phenomenon. It's a harsh reality, but life has always gone on in spite of death. It reminds me of how you'll see a prey animal barely escape a predator, then immediately return to grazing as if nothing happened. To some extent, the ability to forget or ignore tragedy is a key element of survival. In that same vein, when Lee sits down with Jesse, rather than process their emotions or talk about their feelings, the two women simply discuss photography.
Yeah, I got myself a pretty neat travel kit.
I'm impressed.
It's a bittersweet moment given the context, and it shows that the line between one's passion and obsession can be incredibly thin. These photos they're taking are simultaneously beautiful and disturbing.
It's a great photo, Jesse.
They love what they do, but does that justify giving up a little piece of your soul every time you stand back and watch something horrible happen? I honestly don't know, and if you guys have strong feelings one way or the other, I look forward to discussing it with you. Now, like I mentioned, the film doesn't outright condemn people's ability to compartmentalize, and I think this next sequence exemplifies the positive aspects of this phenomenon. That night, we see various shots of people in the refugee camp, and almost all of them seem happy. Despite everything that's going on in the country, all the pain and destruction, these people have been able to form a community and bring out the best in each other. Likewise, when Lee and the others come across a town seemingly untouched by the conflict, she and Jesse share a small moment of peace trying on dresses.
Lee,
Yes.
you're pretty when you smile.
It's brief, but for just one moment, we get to see Lee experience genuine happiness without any caveats or sinister subtext. That being said, when they leave the store, Sammy reveals that things aren't as peaceful as they seem.
Look at the tops of the buildings. Be subtle.
Despite the pleasant facade, the whole town is being watched by rooftop snipers. Now, I was a bit confused by this moment on first viewing, but after watching the film several more times, I think the purpose of this beat is to criticize isolationist practices. When Joel asks the shop owner,
Are you guys aware there's like a pretty huge civil war going on?
and she says,
Oh, sure, but we just try to stay out.
it's an approach that seemingly makes a lot of sense. Just a scene or two ago, Jesse and Lee revealed that their parents were doing the exact same thing.
He's sitting on his farm in Missouri pretending like none of this is happening.
But the snipers on the rooftop reveal that nowhere is truly untouched by this conflict. What happens in one part of the country or the world can easily affect another, no matter how much physical distance there is between either location. After leaving the town, the 4 journalists find a dead body in the middle of an abandoned Christmas fair, and a sniper shoots at their vehicle, forcing them to take cover next to 2 soldiers. Joel wants to know what the story behind this shootout is.
What's going on? Who do you think they are? Are you WF? Who's giving you orders?
But the spotter gives him the only information that matters.
Someone's trying to kill us. We are trying to kill them.
To me, this scene is meant to critique how modern news and media wants to turn everything into a narrative. Joel and the others want to report the truth, but they also want the truth to be a good story. Meanwhile, this is not a narrative for the 3 combatants. This is simply a life or death situation. And when someone is in a life or death situation, there are only a few facts that actually matter.
What's over there in that house?
Someone shooting?
Additionally, this scene ties back into why Alex Garland avoided realistic factions. On a macro level, wars are certainly political, but soldiers aren't given the luxury of having political beliefs. Instead, they're given orders. When another human being is trying to take your life, at least in the moment, the who, what, and why doesn't actually matter. All that matters is staying alive.
I got good news.
Another element of this scene that I adore is that Lee doesn't actually take any pictures. Instead, she lays her head on the ground and focuses on a nearby flower. For the first time in who knows how long, Lee isn't worried about getting the shot. She's taken in a beautiful visual and keeping it just for herself. On top of this, it's a visual that represents life rather than her usual subjects of death and destruction. After the danger is past, the gang gets back on the road, where they encounter 2 other reporters that Joel is friends with. When Jesse gets into the car with Bohai, the 2 speed ahead before seemingly disappearing. When Lee and the others go to investigate, they discover that Jesse and Bohai are being held at gunpoint by men in uniform who are disposing of a large number of bodies. It's unclear what exactly they're doing or why they're here, but as Sammy points out,
those people do not want to be seen doing what they're doing.
After some debate, Lee, Joel, and Tony decide to go talk to the men, despite Sammy begging them not to.
I'm telling you, every instinct in me says this is death, okay? Death.
What follows is undeniably the most tense scene in the entire movie. After Joel explains to Jesse Plemons that they're journalists, Plemons shoots Bohai without remorse or hesitation. When Joel tries to diffuse the tension by saying,
Well, you're American, okay?
Plemons delivers the grimly iconic line,
Okay. What kind of American are you?
Suddenly, each of the remaining characters are forced to answer where they're from, knowing full well that if Plemons doesn't like the answer, then their life could end right here and now. With this in mind, I think it was incredibly smart that they kept it a mystery who these men are reported to. Are they local militia? Are they federal troops gone rogue? Or are they carrying out orders that the government doesn't want people to know about? Any of these explanations could be compelling, but all that matters in this moment is that Plemons has hate in his heart and a weapon in his hand. Because of this, he feels that he gets to choose who is and isn't a real American.
Colorado, Missouri, that's what I'm talking about. It's American.
After Tony gets shot, Sammy comes speeding in with a car, knocking out the 2 men with weapons. Everyone gets in the car and escapes, but in the process, Sammy is fatally wounded. Now, Sammy's death is arguably the most tragic in the film because it's so completely unjust. He was right that going down there would get people killed, but no one would listen to him. He is the most seasoned journalist in the movie, and his instincts were razor sharp. The only reason he gets killed is because his colleagues made a bad decision. That being said, there are a few things that make this loss easier to accept. First off, Sammy made a conscious choice to go save his friends, and his last moments were spent doing something courageous. Additionally, he did exactly what he loved up until the very end. Many people spend their final years yearning for the life they used to lead, but Sammy spent every second of his life dedicated to the thing he loved most. This, however, doesn't provide much comfort for the characters. Despite just how desensitized they all are to violence, it hits on a completely different level when it happens to someone you care about. They can't just brush it off as being part of the job, because Sammy wasn't just a colleague, he was a mentor and a friend. As the group tries to process their loss, we watch as Lee contemplates a picture of Sammy's body before ultimately deciding to delete the photo. It's such a powerful moment because it directly contradicts this beat from earlier in the movie.
Would you photograph that moment if I got shot?
What do you think?
therefore signaling a major change in Lee as a character. It's subtle, but by deleting this picture, she's choosing to value her relationship to a person over her professional pursuits. She's admitting to herself that she has emotions, and that the violence she witnesses does have an impact on her. Soon after arriving at a Western Forces camp, Lee finds out that most of the Federal Army has surrendered, meaning the WF is going to reach DC much sooner than they were expecting.
We missed the story, and Sammy didn't even die for anything good.
Additionally, Jesse reveals to Lee,
These last few days, I've never been scared like that before, and I've never felt more alive.
And even though Lee doesn't say anything, the look she gives Jesse speaks volumes. Lee never wanted Jesse to become like her, but hearing her say those words out loud, Lee knows that Jesse is too far gone. Jesse is just as addicted as Lee or Joel, and the naive girl from the beginning of the movie is long gone. That night, the three of them push in with the WF, documenting their attack on Washington, D.C. Whereas Jesse is now completely unfazed by violence, Lee grows more and more panicked as they push closer and closer to the White House. Outside the front lawn, Joel and the other reporters discuss what the army plans to do with the president.
Kill! No capture!
And joke casually about getting a photo of him.
Hey, Lee! Don't beat me to the money shot, huh?
But Lee couldn't care less about getting the photo. She just wants this all to be over. When the president's motorcade makes a break for it, Lee immediately realizes that it's just a distraction.
He's not in there.
And the three of them walk straight into the White House, where they're joined by a group of WF soldiers.
Stay the out of our way.
Lee, Joel, and Jesse follow closely behind them as they clear through the last pockets of resistance, with Jesse getting into more and more risky positions for the sake of photography. Just before reaching the Oval Office, Jesse foolishly runs out into the open amidst the gunfire. Hoping to save her, Lee pushes her out of the way, but is fatally shot in the process. In this moment, Lee became just like her mentor Sammy. Her instincts were correct, but she died because she cared too much about another person. And in a similar vein, Jesse has now become just like Lee at the beginning of this movie. Cold, professional, and willing to do anything to get a good photograph.
Would you photograph that moment if I got shot?
Without saying a word or shedding a tear, the two remaining journalists walk into the Oval Office, where Joel commands the soldiers to hold their fire.
Wait! I need a quote.
But all the president can say is,
Don't let him kill me.
But this is more than enough for Joel.
Yeah. That'll do.
And with that, Joel gets his interview and Jesse gets her photo. But as the music kicks in and the credits begin to roll, a picture begins to fade into view. 5 soldiers standing over the president. This isn't just any photo, of course. This is the money shot. This is what the whole movie was built on. And as it finishes developing and the title card drops, the audience is left with one simple question. Was it worth it? Civil War was one of the best movies I've seen this year, and one I hope I never have to see again. It's an incredibly insightful film about war, and also incredibly bad at being a war film. It raises questions that are incredibly compelling, and gives definitive answers to almost none of them. So, to go back to that question from earlier, what is this movie actually about? Well, it's about people. It's about how we respond to violence and ignore tragedy. It's about how we lose the people we love and don't always love the people we become. It's about how violence begets violence and how violent conflict has no victors. But with all this in mind, Civil War was never about civil war. I'm Dylan, and this has been The Writer's Block.